You wake up at 3 in the morning, stare at the ceiling, and for a few seconds your mind is completely silent. Then the question arrives without permission. What if I have been afraid of the wrong thing my entire life? Not because you suddenly stopped believing. Not because you became smarter than everyone else, but because you realized that almost everything you know about hell came from conversations, paintings, movies, dramatic sermons, and childhood images, rather than from carefully examining where those ideas actually came from. It is a disturbing realization because fear has a strange way of protecting itself. Once an idea becomes connected to survival, your brain stops asking whether it is true and starts asking how to avoid it. That is how human psychology works. We are remarkably good at preserving beliefs that make us feel safe, even when we have never inspected their foundations. Think about how many people can describe flames, demons, torture, and eternal screams with incredible confidence, yet would struggle to explain why they believe those images belong together in the first place. Confidence is not the same thing as evidence. Familiarity is not the same thing as truth. The picture in your mind may feel ancient, but many parts of it are the result of centuries of interpretation, art, literature, and theological development, rather than a single, simple description. That realization does not automatically prove the traditional view wrong, but it should make anyone intellectually honest pause before saying the discussion is settled. Human beings inherit stories long before they evaluate them. We absorb ideas from our parents, teachers, communities, and culture during the years when questioning authority feels almost impossible. Those ideas become woven into our identity. Eventually, they stop feeling like opinions and begin feeling like reality itself. That transformation is powerful because the mind prefers certainty over ambiguity. If everyone around you repeats the same image often enough, your imagination fills in details that were never explicitly there. Before long, you are defending memories that were constructed collectively rather than conclusions you reached independently. This is not unique to religion. It happens in politics, family traditions, national identity, and countless everyday assumptions. The deeper an idea becomes tied to belonging, the harder it becomes to examine without feeling like betrayal. That is why conversations about hell become emotional so quickly. They are rarely just about the afterlife. They are about trust, identity, morality, fear, and the communities that shaped us. Ask yourself a simple question. If you had been born in a different country, into a different religious tradition, hearing different stories from childhood, would the image in your mind still be exactly the same? Most people instinctively answer yes because they believe truth should not depend on geography. Yet the beliefs people actually hold often do depend on geography. That fact alone does not tell us which belief is correct, but it reminds us how strongly culture influences what feels obvious. We often mistake inherited certainty for independent reasoning. Psychology calls this confirmation bias. Once we accept an idea, we naturally notice information that supports it while overlooking information that complicates it. Our brains are not designed to seek perfect objectivity. They are designed to create coherent stories that help us navigate uncertainty. That tendency becomes especially powerful when the subject involves ultimate questions about life, death, justice, and meaning. Fear narrows attention. Anxiety rewards simple answers. Complexity feels threatening because it forces us to admit how much remains unknown. Yet history repeatedly shows that the first explanation people embrace is not always the most accurate one. Throughout history, the language surrounding judgment and the afterlife has been interpreted in different ways by different communities. Some scholars emphasize imagery as symbolic language communicating separation from God, moral consequence, or ultimate justice. Others understand certain passages more literally. Still others argue that some descriptions reflect the literary style of their time rather than detailed maps of the afterlife. There are debates over words translated into English as hell, debates about metaphor and apocalypse, debates about justice and mercy, debates that have existed for centuries. That diversity should not be surprising. Ancient texts emerged from specific historical contexts, languages, and audiences. Translating them into modern assumptions is rarely as straightforward as people imagine. None of this proves one interpretation correct, but it does demonstrate something uncomfortable. The confidence many people express often exceeds the certainty the historical evidence can actually provide. That gap between certainty and evidence is worth noticing because it appears in many areas of life. We crave black and white answers because uncertainty is exhausting. But reality frequently refuses to cooperate. Imagine someone who spent decades terrified that every mistake condemned them forever. They avoided honest questions because questioning itself felt dangerous. They obeyed out of fear rather than understanding. Outwardly, they appeared deeply committed. Inwardly, they lived with constant anxiety. Every failure became evidence that they were beyond hope. Every intrusive thought became another reason to panic. Eventually, fear became their religion more than love, wisdom, or transformation ever did. Whether or not their theology was correct, their psychology deserves attention. Fear can produce compliance, but it can also distort perception. A frightened mind often sees danger everywhere. It interprets ambiguity as threat. It assumes the worst because anticipating disaster feels safer than risking surprise. That is why fear has been such an effective force throughout human history. It motivates behavior quickly. It creates group cohesion. It discourages dissent. Yet fear also carries a hidden cost. It discourages curiosity. It punishes honest investigation. It replaces understanding with reflex. If someone believes that asking difficult questions itself is evidence of moral failure, genuine exploration becomes nearly impossible. Ironically, that mindset can leave a person defending ideas they have never actually examined. There is another psychological layer that people rarely acknowledge. Human beings possess a profound desire for justice. We look at cruelty, exploitation, violence, betrayal, and suffering and instinctively want the universe to balance the scales. That desire is understandable. We have all watched people who seem to escape accountability. We have seen innocent people suffer while selfish individuals prosper. Deep inside, we long for a reality in which evil ultimately matters. Discussions about hell often intersect with that longing. The debate is not only about punishment. It is also about whether justice exists beyond the limits of this world. Different philosophical and theological traditions answer that question differently, but the emotional motivation remains recognizable. We want meaning. We want accountability. We want to believe that cruelty is not the final chapter. Those hopes influence interpretation whether we realize it or not. The challenge is recognizing when emotional need begins shaping our conclusions. Wanting something to be true is not proof that it is true. Wanting something to be false is not proof that it is false either. Honest thinking requires the humility to separate emotional preference from evidence as much as possible. That is harder than it sounds because our identities are constantly involved. Every belief carries social consequences. Accepting one interpretation may strengthen relationships, while another may threaten them. Communities reward agreement. Families pass down expectations. Institutions preserve traditions. None of those realities automatically invalidate a belief, but they do explain why changing one's mind can feel like losing a part of oneself. Sometimes the greatest obstacle to new understanding is not lack of intelligence, but fear of isolation. Humans are social creatures. Belonging has always been tied to survival. Challenging inherited assumptions risks misunderstanding, criticism, and loneliness. That emotional cost explains why many people stop asking questions long before they reach satisfying answers. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that progress often begins with uncomfortable questions rather than comfortable certainty. Whether the topic is science, philosophy, politics, or religion, intellectual honesty requires the courage to distinguish between what we know, what we think we know, and what remains uncertain. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is not that hell is exactly what you were taught or completely different from what you imagined. Perhaps the unsettling possibility is realizing how easily the human mind confuses vivid imagery with established fact. We remember dramatic pictures more easily than nuanced arguments. Stories shape memory more effectively than analysis. Paintings, novels, films, and emotional sermons leave impressions that linger for decades. Eventually, those impressions begin to feel inseparable from the original sources that inspired them. Yet memory is reconstructive rather than photographic. Every recollection is influenced by previous beliefs, expectations, and experiences. That is true whether the subject is childhood, history, or religion. Recognizing that fact is not an attack on faith. It is an invitation to intellectual humility. Humility is not weakness. It is the willingness to admit that reality may be more complex than our first assumptions. Perhaps that is the real challenge, hidden beneath every difficult conversation about hell. Not deciding too quickly what happens after death, but deciding what kind of person you become while searching for the truth. Do you protect comforting conclusions at any cost, or do you remain willing to examine them honestly? Do you seek certainty because it feels safe, or understanding because it is worth pursuing even when it is uncomfortable? Those questions reach far beyond theology. They shape every important decision we make. If this reflection has reminded you that asking careful questions is not the enemy of sincere belief, but often its strongest companion, stay with this conversation by subscribing and continue exploring ideas with the same commitment to curiosity, humility, and independent thought. The longer you sit with the question, the more you realize that the discussion is not simply about what happens after death. It is about how people interpret language, history, symbolism, and justice. One reason the topic has remained controversial for centuries is that the biblical texts themselves contain a variety of images and terms that have been understood in different ways by different communities. In the Hebrew Bible, references to the realm of the dead often use concepts that many scholars distinguish from the later popular image of hell. In the New Testament, different Greek words appear in different contexts, and interpreters have debated for generations whether they always refer to the same idea or whether they carry distinct meanings. Some theologians understand these passages as describing a conscious state of eternal punishment. Others argue they primarily communicate separation from God. Still others emphasize symbolic or apocalyptic language, suggesting that vivid imagery serves to communicate the seriousness of moral choices rather than provide a literal geographical description of the afterlife. None of these perspectives can simply be dismissed because each draws upon historical context, linguistic analysis, and theological reasoning. That alone should encourage intellectual humility. It reminds us that sincere people studying the same texts with equal dedication have often reached different conclusions. This is not unusual in history. Ancient writings frequently use poetry, metaphor, hyperbole, and symbolic imagery in ways that modern readers can easily misunderstand if they approach them as though they were written yesterday. The challenge, then, is not deciding too quickly which interpretation feels most emotionally satisfying. The challenge is recognizing how easily our expectations shape what we think we see. Imagine reading a story from another civilization thousands of years from now. Without understanding its culture, its literary conventions, or its audience, you might interpret symbolic expressions as literal descriptions or overlook metaphors that would have been obvious to the original readers. Historians constantly face this problem. They ask not only what a text says, but what it would have communicated to the people who first heard it. That approach does not eliminate disagreement, but it encourages careful reasoning over confident assumptions. It also reveals something about ourselves. We naturally read ancient words through modern imaginations. Our minds fill in gaps with familiar images inherited from books, films, artwork, conversations, and traditions. Over time, those images become so familiar that separating the text from later interpretations becomes surprisingly difficult. This is one reason the history of religious art has had such a profound influence on public imagination. Powerful paintings, dramatic literature, and unforgettable visual depictions have shaped how millions picture the afterlife, sometimes reinforcing particular theological traditions and sometimes blending ideas from multiple sources. Recognizing that influence does not tell us which interpretation is correct. It simply reminds us that cultural memory and historical evidence are not always identical. The psychological dimension is equally important. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We instinctively search for patterns that explain suffering, reward, justice, and hope. Questions about the afterlife are therefore never purely intellectual. They are deeply personal. They touch grief, loss, guilt, forgiveness, and the hope that our choices matter. Those emotional realities can strengthen faith, but they can also make it harder to examine our assumptions with complete detachment. That is why thoughtful inquiry requires both curiosity and humility. Curiosity asks difficult questions without assuming the answers in advance. Humility recognizes that some questions have been debated for centuries by serious scholars, philosophers, historians, and believers who approached them in good faith. Whether one ultimately embraces a traditional doctrine, a symbolic interpretation, or remains uncertain, the process of examining the evidence carefully is itself valuable. It encourages us to distinguish between what is explicitly stated, what is historically inferred, what is theologically interpreted, and what has become part of popular imagination over time. That distinction does not weaken sincere belief. If anything, it can deepen it by moving conviction from inherited assumptions toward informed reflection. And even for those who remain unconvinced by any religious framework, the discussion raises enduring philosophical questions about justice, morality, accountability, and the human search for meaning. Those questions deserve more than quick answers. They deserve careful thought, honest dialogue, and the willingness to recognize complexity where complexity genuinely exists. If these conversations challenge you to think more carefully, rather than simply react more quickly, consider subscribing and continuing to explore difficult questions with the same commitment to evidence, historical context, and intellectual honesty. The deeper you investigate, the more another uncomfortable pattern begins to emerge. People often assume that if a belief has existed for a very long time, its meaning must have remained unchanged. History suggests otherwise. Ideas evolve, languages evolve, cultures evolve. Even within the same religious tradition, interpretations can develop as new historical circumstances, philosophical questions, and linguistic discoveries arise. That does not mean earlier generations were necessarily wrong, or later generations are necessarily right. It means that understanding any ancient concept requires patience. One of the greatest mistakes modern readers make is assuming that people living 2,000 years ago thought exactly as we do today. They did not. Their worldview, literary styles, political realities, and cultural assumptions were dramatically different. Words carried associations that can easily disappear across centuries. Images that immediately communicated one idea to an ancient audience may suggest something entirely different to a modern reader. Historians therefore spend enormous effort reconstructing context before drawing conclusions. They compare manuscripts, study archaeology, examine neighboring cultures, analyze language, and ask how the earliest audiences would likely have understood particular expressions. That process rarely produces absolute certainty, but it often reveals that the questions are more nuanced than popular discussions suggest. The same is true psychologically. Our minds are remarkably efficient at simplifying complicated subjects into memorable stories. Simplicity helps us remember, communicate, and teach ideas. Yet simplicity can also blur important distinctions. Once a simplified version becomes widespread, challenging it feels almost like challenging reality itself. This phenomenon extends far beyond religion. It affects how societies remember historical events, how families preserve traditions, and how individuals construct personal identities. We tell ourselves coherent stories because coherence feels reassuring. But coherence and completeness are not always the same thing. Sometimes the most intellectually responsible position is acknowledging that evidence supports several plausible interpretations rather than pretending every question has been settled beyond dispute. That willingness to live with uncertainty is difficult because uncertainty feels emotionally expensive. Human beings naturally seek closure. We prefer clear endings over unresolved questions. We like definitive answers because they reduce anxiety. Yet many of the most important questions humanity has ever asked remain subjects of ongoing discussion. That reality is not a failure of reason. It reflects the complexity of the subjects themselves. Questions about justice, consciousness, morality, existence, and what may lie beyond death have occupied philosophers, theologians, historians, and scientists for centuries. No single discipline answers all of them completely. Each contributes part of a larger conversation, recognizing that complexity does not require abandoning conviction. It requires holding conviction with enough humility to distinguish between what one believes, why one believes it, and what remains open to further exploration. That distinction encourages conversations that are driven by evidence and careful reasoning, rather than fear or hostility. It also creates room for genuine dialogue between people who ultimately reach different conclusions. In a world increasingly divided by certainty, perhaps one of the most valuable intellectual habits is learning how to ask better questions without assuming that asking them is itself a threat. Whether you ultimately affirm a traditional understanding of hell, adopt a different theological interpretation, or remain unconvinced altogether, the discipline of examining assumptions carefully is valuable in its own right. It teaches us to recognize the influence of culture, memory, language, emotion, and community on our thinking. More importantly, it reminds us that the pursuit of truth is not strengthened by refusing difficult questions, but by engaging them with honesty, patience, and intellectual integrity. If you appreciate conversations that challenge assumptions without asking you to stop thinking for yourself, consider subscribing and continue exploring history, psychology, philosophy, and belief with the same commitment to careful reflection.